So this is how to paint water, like actually paint water. For those of you who follow me on Instagram, you will know the journey that I've had learning to paint water. I watched so many YouTube videos, and some of them were helpful and some of them were not as helpful. So I'm hoping that this video will definitely be helpful for you. Because at the end of the day, I just had to practice and figure out my own technique, so I'm here to share it with you. So I put my base color down first, which is just this light blue. And then I'm going in and marking out some key waves that I would like to include, and just including just a basic outline of some shadows for those waves. And I'm using a darker blue and I'm using a finer brush. That way I can get into the details and create nice thin lines. I'm also working from a reference photo, so that way I know exactly how big the shadows are and where they are. And I'm trying to look at my reference photo as objectively as I can. I'm trying to trust my eyes and trying not to make up what I see, but recreate exactly what I see. I'm using a variety of shades for the shadows because some of the shadows are darker than others. So it's good to have a variety of medium blues. So for the wave that's lapping up onto the shore, I'm taking one of the medium blues and I'm placing it just along the edge, just above where I placed my darkest blue. And this later on will give a very 3D or realistic effect to the sea foam that will be lapping up onto the shore. I'm following my reference pretty closely, and I am making sure that I create those shadows, those lighter shadows, as best as I can to what I see in my reference. And I'm just putting down those basic shapes, and then I am going to blend them out just a little bit so that way they look a little more natural. And because this is acrylic paint, it dries pretty quickly, so I'm constantly having to have each of my shades of blue ready to go, so that way I can quickly change between them when I need to. And I'm just doing a lot of blending, a lot of back and forth between my lighter blues and my medium blues, trying to copy exactly what I see in my reference. I got rid of that painter's tape so that way you can see the perspective that I'm working with a little bit better. And then because this is a sunset, I'm going to take some purple as well. And I'm going to use that to create the waves that are closest to the sunset and furthest away from the viewer. And I'm using a very thin brush to create these small waves that are far away. And your brush size will depend on the size of canvas that you are using. Because even my smallest brush here is not as small as you could go painting wise. So just keep that in mind as you're creating your own water piece. Take into account how big your canvas is. So once I have my base colors down and this first layer down, then I can add more layers on top. And because this piece is a sunset, I'm using some gold hues, but you will paint whatever you see in your reference photo. Maybe you'll just have white, maybe you'll have a variety of greens, who knows? But I'm gonna focus on using the colors that I see in my reference. So I noticed that light reflections that are closest to the viewer are very faded, like they fade into the water a lot more smoothly, but as they recede into the background, they become more defined. So you can see that in the middle of my piece, I've created a lot more defined lines, whereas the ones that are closest to the bottom and closest to the viewer are more faded out or more blended out. And then I'm just building those layers. I'm starting off with my darker layers and then I'm going on top with my lightest colors. You'll notice that in the reflection, my lightest color is not actually going to be white, but it's going to be a very, very light yellow. And these highlights are going to be very defined. I don't want to blend them out because I want them to stand out and to have that high contrast. So now I'm taking my medium blue and I am going and creating some of those medium shadows that you would see in the water. Some of them will be more defined, like I said, in the center of the piece, but as they come closer to the bottom and closer to the viewer, they will be more blended out into the rest of the water. And I'm just playing with it. I'm going as close as I can to the reference, and so I'm going back and forth between the variety of blues that I use. Sometimes there will be a little more defined waves in the bottom part that's closest to the viewer, and sometimes it will be more blended out. I'm adding a lot of little shadows to the sea foam that you'll see as it slowly starts to develop. And so I'm using this medium blue all over the water just to bring that unity and that cohesiveness. And I'm just trying to keep them in the same formation that I did the earlier waves with the highlights. I'm trying to keep that going and extending that pattern all throughout the piece. That way it looks like it's all the same body of water and not like a bunch of different techniques and, you know, a muddled mess that way. I'm trying to keep it as unified as possible. Now, this is probably the part of the painting where I would give up hope or like, that's a bad way to put it, but like, you know what I mean? Like there's always like an ugly stage of the painting, and not that this is an ugly part of the painting, but it's just sort of like, okay, where am I going with this? What am I gonna do? So that's when I bring in the darkest shadows to really bring in the definition. So now you might look at this painting at this point and you might think, oh my goodness, those are so many details. Do I have to get those exact shapes? The answer is no, you don't. Just follow whatever reference that you're working with. And also, I'm following my reference closely, but not to the point where, you know, if I mess up a single detail, a single shadow, like, oh, it's the end of the world. No, I'm not doing that. I am being intentional, and I'm just trying to get the gist of what's there. Because at the end of the day, this is a painting, it's not a photograph, so you don't have to be super precise. And even if you want your piece to be realistic looking, you still don't have to get it super precise, because guess what? Water is always changing and always moving. There's no like set pattern to what it could look like. So you can see here that I'm just playing with it. I'm doing lots of different layers. I'm bringing in some lighter blues, some darker blues. I'm following my reference to get an idea of where those dark blues and light blues should be, paying special attention to where I think the light would hit. And I'm using a smaller brush for this part, just to get in those tiny little bubbles, those tiny, tiny little waves. And then I realized I wanted it to be a little bit lighter. So I took some of that lighter blue just to create that more foamy, sea foamy effect, to separate it from the water, to distinguish it like, okay, this is a particular type of water. This is the more bubbly part. So it's going to be a little bit lighter than the rest of the body of water. So I'm blending that out, as well as keeping some more defined sections, and those sections a little bit fast and loose, a little bit organic that way. I'm not being too particular with how they are created. I'm still keeping it pretty natural and organic. So as you can see, it takes a little bit of time. Like, yes, this footage is also sped up, but it does take a little playing around with getting that right look. So don't be afraid to paint over some parts that are just not working. You can see that I do that several times throughout this painting, and the painting will change, and that'll be a good thing. So once I'm happy with the general sort of shadows and layout of light, I'm going in and I am defining some of those waves, some of those bubbles a little bit more. And I'm doing it very gradually, very slowly. I'm bringing in some dark, I'm bringing in some light, I'm going back and forth, trying to get that right look. And so bubbles in the water are not normally something we would see sort of frozen in time. So we don't know what they naturally look like, and that's why it's important to work from a photograph or a reference photo, just to try to get those bubbles to look natural as possible. And what's nice about painting something like this is that there's so many good things to paint and so many things that could easily make you frustrated. So if one part of the painting is making you frustrated, you can always go and work on another part of the painting just to relieve your mind of that. So I'm doing that by blending out. Oh, I'm completely changing it. Okay. All right. I did not expect that. All right. Well, you know what? That's a good thing, because I was looking at it earlier and I was like, I don't remember it looking like that in the final result. I wonder what I did to fix it. This is what I did to fix it. I just painted right over it. Like I was saying earlier, it's okay to do that. If you don't like the way something is looking, you can paint right over it and repaint it again. So for this section of the highlights from the reflection of the sun, I'm blending it out a lot more because I wanted a more softer look. I wanted the blues to blend a little bit better with those yellows, those golden hues. That way it'll look a little bit natural. Like I was saying earlier, the waves are more defined farther away, and then as they're closer to the viewer, they are a lot more blended out together. And so now I'm going in and I am creating those original waves so that they look a little bit more like waves. I'm taking those highlights with a very small brush and I am going in and creating the part where the wave sort of falls over onto itself and the white part that goes along the rim. That's the part that I'm working on right now. And so you can take note of where the wave sort of blends out into the rest of the water and then where it is more prominent, because your wave will look more realistic or more fake depending on how you get that shape. So again, that's why it's good to work from a reference. And you can also see how I've done that here. And I'm not using white for any of these foamy parts or for any of these splash parts because I don't actually see white in my reference photo. Everything is still a little bit in a shadow because nothing will be as bright as the sun. And so I'm actually just using a light blue to create those highlights and to create those foamy, splashy parts of the wave. And I also don't want to have a very harsh edge from the shadow of the waves to the rest of the water. I want to blend that out a little bit so it looks more natural and it looks like the wave is coming up from the rest of the water rather than just a strip painted on top of the rest of it. It's all about cohesiveness and making it look like it all belongs together. And I feel like a lot of this tutorial I'm talking about brushes, but brushes are so important, right? Like you want to use small brushes to get into those more defined tiny detail areas, and then bigger brushes to like put down the base color, let's say, of your whole water. And so I think it's important to have a variety of brushes when you decide to paint water. That way you can get those smaller details and get those larger details as well. Like have some rounded brushes, have some filbert brushes. I don't think you'll necessarily need like a flat edge or a square shaped brush, but definitely have a variety of sizes of those more rounded brushes. And it's good to remember to blend out any sort of transitional colors. So like when I'm adding these highlights to the shadows of the waves, I'm still blending them out just a little bit. It's hard for you to see on camera, but I'm still doing that. Like I'm still keeping them very distinct, but I want to make sure that they are blended and more unified. Now for this next section, I did some experimenting. I was trying to play around with the highlights, bringing in more of that golden glow from the sunset, and I experimented with the opacity. So as you can see, some of that color from before was showing through, but I really didn't like how that looked. So I ended up painting over this section almost entirely, just to try to redo it to get it to look the way I wanted to. So I'm putting down a slightly goldy base blue than what I had earlier. The original blue was just mainly a light blue, but this time it has a little bit of that gold. And I'm just bringing in very small amounts of those darker medium blues, and I'm building it up very slowly. I'm keeping some of the parts very blended out and then some a little more defined, and I'm trying to make it a little more natural looking rather than very harsh human-made lines. Now I'm adding even more shadows to the sea foam or the part that's lapping up onto the shore, just to give it that further definition from the rest of the body of water, that this is a different perspective, this is a different part of the water, so it's going to look a lot different. But again, I'm not straying from my reference. I noticed that it is a little bit darker towards the viewer rather than in the middle where all the highlights are, and so I'm just bringing that in a little bit further. And I'm adding some shadows underneath where the wave is lapping up onto the shore, where it's touching the sand, just to give it that separation, as well as to give it a very three-dimensional effect. And I'm adding some smaller shadows just near where that first wave blends into the rest of the body of water, just to give it more intentionality and definition, to make it look more intentional. I'm just talking in circles now. You know, sometimes it's just a little bit tricky to figure out how to explain what I'm doing when you can also just see what I'm doing. So if you have any questions of how I did something, or if you want to know more, you can let me know in the comments and I'd be happy to help you. But hopefully in combination with what I'm saying, as well as what you're seeing, you'll be able to recreate this on your own. And I think one major technique that I've been using all throughout this painting is using a bunch of small, short brush strokes, as well as building up many layers and going back and forth between a variety of shades. And of course, for the waves furthest away from the viewer, I'm using a very small brush stroke and lots of them using that medium dark blue for those shadows that are far away. And so here are some up-close shots of the final result. This is what my water ended up looking like. If you like this video or learned something, please give it a like. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments and I'll be happy to help. And if you want to see more, you are welcome to subscribe. Thanks for watching.